So when people come up to me now and say, wow, our grandchildren are really going to have to pay for this, I look at them and I said, you're paying for it. Inflation is taxation.
War right now breaking out in Ukraine. Is this our fight? Joining us today to discuss this and several topics is Congressman Thomas Massie of Kentucky. Congressman Massie, thank you for joining us today again at the New American.
Thanks for having me on, Christian. Always a pleasure to be on your show.
So last time that I had you on, I asked you about the situation in Ukraine before Russia invaded, essentially, and whether if you saw U.S. participation as dragging us into a Vietnam-style conflict, seeing how Kennedy and Eisenhower sent aid and troops to those countries prior to our entry, thus precipitating our involvement in that conflict. Now that hot war has broken out for almost a month now, where do you stand on the situation there? Should the U.S. send more military equipment, more aid, or should we just mind our business?
Well, we should mind our business, that's for sure. We shouldn't try to escalate the situation there. We should be acting to de-escalate it if we have any involvement whatsoever. We shouldn't be implementing a no-fly zone. That's an act of war, frankly, to shoot down Russian jets with American jets or even American missiles. If we wanted to sell defensive weapons to Ukraine, I think that's okay. I mean, they have a right to self-determination, to sovereignty, and to determine their own government and not to be invaded by another country. But this shouldn't be a custody battle. You know, I feel like it's a little bit of a custody battle between the European Union and the Soviet Union, or what used to be the Soviet Union. They don't really need to be in any union. No country needs to be in any union. You know, a lot of my conservative friends celebrated Brexit and the fact that Great Britain got out of the European Union. But the same friends, some of them are saying, oh, yeah, Zelensky's right. Ukraine should join the European Union. Of course, it's up to them to decide what to join and what not to join, but it is going to irritate Russia if they make alliances with NATO or even the European Union going forward.
Yeah, since when did the European Union become a bastion of liberty and freedom, especially since the UK voted for Brexit?
Yeah, and speaking of bastions of liberty, when did any European country become a bastion of liberty? I don't think U.S. taxpayers should be subsidizing the defense of socialist countries in Europe. And by that, I'm talking about NATO. Congress has already voted, since the conflict broke out in Ukraine, to send more money and more weapons to NATO, to the Eastern European countries. And, that's supposed to be in anticipation or as a deterrent to Putin. But, when did the American taxpayers agree to be conscripted? Of course, they didn't agree if they're being conscripted, but conscripted into the defense of these socialist countries. They never have, except by the representatives and senators, and I think we should quit doing that.
Absolutely. And of course, speaking of Ukraine, President Zelenskyy spoke before, I guess, a session of, would that be considered a session of Congress when you were all huddled together, shoulder to shoulder, no masks, by the way, in the auditorium room with the giant projection on the screen of Zelenskyy speaking? Of course, we've heard a lot of your colleagues, Republican colleagues in both the House and the Senate, discuss putting Putin under potential war crime violations, empowering the International Criminal Court of Justice, which is connected with the United Nations, and even other Republicans are discussing strengthening our commitments to the United Nations, when just a few years ago, strengthening our commitment to NATO, the NATO alliance, when just a few years ago, President Trump was discussing cutting funds from NATO because other countries were not doing their fair share, and it essentially had become a form of military welfare for Europe. What do you? What's your take on your Republican colleagues that are calling for more aid to NATO, more involvement in the conflict over there?
Well, look, NATO wasn't established to protect the United States. Let's be honest. It was established as a check against the Soviet Union and its empire, but that empire fell. It collapsed under its own weight. And so, frankly, as it's constituted, NATO's purpose doesn't exist anymore, or the reason for its founding. Going back to Zelensky's address to Congress, I would say that was a joint session of Congress because I saw senators in there as well in that auditorium, and it had a little bit of an Orwellian feel to it. We're in there shoulder to shoulder, as you said, looking at this giant screen of this foreign leader who then puts on a movie that was meant to play to the emotions of my colleagues. And frankly, it worked. I mean, it was propaganda. When did U.S. Congress sign up to go in a room and receive propaganda from another foreign leader? Of course, that was arranged by the State Department. The State Department wants Congress to do its bidding and to send more money. And fortunately, we haven't voted for a no-fly zone. That would be an act of war. And Joe Biden can't do that on his own. There was a resolution in Congress that was going to put sanctions on Russia and on Putin, but buried on pages 19, 20, and 21, it gave President Biden or any president after him broad authority to sanction individuals if he believed they were corrupt or if he believed they were violating human rights. And they didn't have to be connected with Russia. This is called the Global Magnitsky Act, and it expanded it. It also got rid of the expiration date on it. So any president going forward can sanction virtually anybody. And I know the State Department snuck that in there, and my colleagues didn't really read the bill, or if they did, they didn't think about the implications of it, because that gives the president way too much power.
Absolutely. And speaking about sitting there in that room shoulder to shoulder with all your colleagues not wearing masks, you have a lawsuit against the CDC, along with several members of Congress that have joined you, to end the mask mandate. I mean, we have some flights that aren't even as crowded as the session of Congress that you were in, whether it was the Zelensky speech or the Biden, the State of the Union address, but yet we're required, and even you yourself, if you're flying on a commercial airline, are required to wear a face mask. So tell us about your lawsuit and how that's progressing.
Yeah, so I haven't flown since July. I drive 8 hours to D.C. and 8 hours back every week that I'm there. And it's gotten a little tiring, but I refuse to wear the mask. Now some of my colleagues fly and they have to wear the mask. So we all have standing in this lawsuit, meaning that we are suffering harm because of the CDC's actions. Now the CDC is basically the root for this mandate, and they claim authority under a statute that they use to claim authority for the eviction moratorium. Now the Supreme Court ruled on that last summer and narrowly construed the meaning of that statute. It allows CDC, for instance, to do fumigation or to destroy livestock in order to contain a pandemic. But it doesn't say that it can make everybody wear a mask. It doesn't say they can intervene in private rental contracts. So that's why we sued them. The hypocrisy was getting too great. You had Zelensky's address to Congress with no masks. You had Joe Biden's address to Congress with no masks. And so we said it's time to end this for all people flying on planes. I think we've got a good chance. We've got venue in the Western District of Kentucky. We've got a Federalist judge. And there's a concurrent lawsuit in Texas that Representative Beth Van Dyne and Ken Paxton have introduced, and there's a few other lawsuits. I think we're going to get an injunction in one of these hearings somewhere. I hope it's my case. Senator Rand Paul and 16 other congressmen have joined me in that case suing the CDC.
And there are also a group of airline pilots. I believe it's 10 airline pilots from various airline companies, from JetBlue, Delta, and so forth, Southwest Airlines, that are suing as well. So with all these various lawsuits coming in at the CDC, you imagine that one of them will at least be victorious to end this mask mandate.
Yeah, how ridiculous is that pilots have to wear a mask? Why would you want their CO2 levels elevated and their oxygen levels depressed if they're responsible for the lives of a couple hundred people on that plane? That just seems ridiculous to me. And so I hope they win that lawsuit. Any of these lawsuits I think will get a national injunction and would immediately end the mask mandate. So we're hoping either they succeed or the case in Texas succeeds, and there may be a case filed in Florida soon. But if any one of them succeeds, we'll get a national injunction and people can breathe freely again on airplanes.
Well, of course, we wish the best of luck to you in that lawsuit so all of us can breathe freely. So 2 years ago, when President Trump was still in the White House, during the height of the coronavirus pandemic, there was supposed to be, Congress was scheduled to vote on a multi-trillion-dollar, $2 to $3 trillion coronavirus aid package, which, of course, you brought up the point of order that members of Congress had to be in attendance to vote for what was at that time, and probably still is, I believe, if the record hasn't been broken, the largest spending bill ever in American history that was voted on. And you weren't really popular that day, even with President Trump for calling that for that vote. But ultimately, you voted against that package. And of course, the mainstream media went after you for the point of order and for voting against that. So how is that vote aged now, considering inflation?
Well, I've got a lot of colleagues now who will admit to me in private that they wish they had joined me on that day. You know, injecting $2 trillion into the money supply is a very dangerous thing, and paying people not to work and encouraging governors to shut down their economies. Those things all led to the inflation we're seeing right now. Now, another $5 trillion was spent in the name of COVID. So we spent about $7 trillion all told. But a lot of Republicans are blaming Joe Biden right now and forgetting that they were excoriating me for saying that we should have a debate and we should have a vote and we should have to show up to vote on that. Another thing happened. That was a $2.2 trillion package, but Larry Kudlow got on TV a couple days before that passed and said it was really a $6 trillion package because Congress was going to give authority to the Federal Reserve to loan out $4 trillion based on having $400 billion in assets. Now, something else very dangerous happened as we spent those $7 trillion. There weren't $7 trillion to borrow. It wasn't sitting around in certificates of deposit and checking accounts and corporate accounts. The government didn't issue bonds and collect that money that existed. There just wasn't enough money in existence. So what happened is the Federal Reserve, out of thin air, created trillions of dollars and then bought Treasury securities. And in other words, we monetized the debt. We monetized trillions of dollars of debt. We used to make fun of third world countries for doing this.
I was about to say, isn't this what third world countries typically do when they're in when they need money? They just make more money.
Yeah, and there are some Western countries that have laws on the books that keep their own countries from monetizing debt. And so they have to either borrow it internally from their Social Security funds, which our government does as well, or they have to borrow it from private institutions, or they have to tax their citizens. So when people come up to me now and say, wow, our grandchildren are really going to have to pay for this, I look at them and I said, you're paying for it. Inflation is taxation when the government creates it by printing money. And so that's what's happened. I'm really happy with the stand that I took 2 years ago. By the way, that was March 27th. We're almost on the 2-year anniversary. And March 27th was about the 11th of 15 days to slow the spread. Remember, they said we would have 15 days to slow the spread. We are 100 weeks into slowing the spread. We are 3 jabs into slowing the spread. We are 2 presidents. We're $7 trillion, and we're a shredded and we have a shredded constitution. All of that to slow the spread of a virus that everybody practically got anyway, whether they were vaccinated or not.
Yeah, instead of flattening the curve, what they have done is flatten liberty in the process.
Well, they flattened a lot of bank accounts too, and they're flattening the dollar. $7 trillion divided by 120 million households in this country is $53,000 per household. 2 years ago, I pointed out that the $1,200 was the cheese in the trap, and that this was a big transfer of wealth from the middle class to the upper class, to the very upper class. And that's what happened. You saw the stock market double. You saw the richest, 8 billionaires, their net worth went up incredibly. Yet, look at the American people. They didn't get $53,000 yet. That's how much money was spent per household. They got a $1,200 check, a $600 check, and a $1,400 check. That's what they got. And then if you took a vaccine, those cost the government $50 a piece, supposedly. Why did we spend $53,000 per family when if the family got 9 vaccines, that was $450? That was like only 1% of that was spent on vaccines. Where did all that money go?
Yeah, and then at the same time, as those votes were cast, we have an election coming up in November, and you would think that some of your colleagues, even your colleagues on the other side of the aisle, that they would want to be maybe a little bit more fiscally prudent considering the massive inflation, and yet they're also talking about wanting the Build Back Better Act. They're talking about the PRO Act and various other expensive pieces of legislation. Where's that money going to come from? Even the aid to Ukraine, you mentioned in the first half, that it would be better if Ukraine was to purchase that as opposed to just giving it away for free. So where does the money come for us to even send them the equipment and purchase it? Don't we have to borrow that money from somewhere to then just give it away for free to the Ukrainians if that's what Congress and Biden ultimately decides to do?
Well, we could borrow it if the money were available to loan. But the reality is all the other governments on the planet practically are spending any money that they would have available to loan out. And so the money's not available to loan, so we'll be printing it. Although if you listen to Nancy Pelosi, she says that printing money doesn't add to the debt. If you believe that, I've got some swampland to sell you down there in Florida, which is actually probably pretty valuable now that Ron DeSantis is governor.
Absolutely. Well, speaking of Congress and how Congress is broken, there are some people across the country who think that we have to rein in Congress through the process of an Article 5 convention of states or our constitutional convention. Now, you've made some tweets both in 2018 and on December 9th of 2021 against an Article 5 convention. I believe your last tweet you mentioned, show me a constitutionalist majority legislature at this time. And if you can't, well, an Article 5 convention of states would be a disaster. Essentially, I'm paraphrasing your tweet. Why else do you oppose an Article 5 convention? I mean, are legislators at the state level being naive in supporting this call for a convention?
Look, first of all, it doesn't involve Congress. If you do this, this is a way around Congress. So, frankly, it's none of my business if the people want to do this. But here's what I'm afraid will happen. The worst of the worst will rise to the top. The people that, for instance, control the party nominations, those are the kind of people that will control these conventions. And if you look at how many Republicans believe the last election was legitimate, and if it's like maybe 10, 20%, but it's the same number among Democrats. If you look at when Hillary Clinton lost the election. So if you had a constitutional convention, whatever the outcome is going to be, a large portion of the population is going to say it's invalid. And now they have another reason not to follow the Constitution. Look, most of my colleagues commit perjury the first day of office because they take an oath to the Constitution that they've never read, or if they have read it, they have no intention of following it. So they're committing perjury. And they use excuses like it's outdated, whatever, and that's why they don't follow it, or it's a living document. Just imagine if we have a constitutional convention, the number of people who will be unhappy and the number of people who say the results are not valid, and then they'll just ignore the entire Constitution, even more so than they do today.
So if not an Article 5 convention, what do you recommend that citizens do then to at least attempt to rein in the federal government and bring it back to its constitutional limitations?
They've got to get smarter about who they elect, and they need to pay attention in primaries. I don't care if you're a Republican or a Democrat. A lot of these Senate races, probably 2/3 of the Senate races, and probably 80% of the House races are determined in the primary. And the people of this country have about a 10% approval rating of Congress, rightly so. But most of them have about a 70% approval rating of their own congressman. And they need to realize that in many cases, their own congressman is the fault. And so they need to insist on separate bills, that Congress pass separate bills so they can have the transparency to know who are the bad congressmen and who are the good ones.
Well, thank you so much, Congressman Massie. Of course, we'll keep in touch with you, and take care, and God bless you.
Thanks for having me on, Christian.
Thank you.